Welcome to the Functional Medicine Doc Talk podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kurt Woeller, talking with experts in functional and integrative health and medicine, discussing critical information for improving your health and wellness to help you live a long, full life. Let's get to it. Well, hello, everybody. This is Dr. Kurt Woeller, and welcome to the podcast. We're going to talk about something called the Exposome. This is a term or a concept that probably most people haven't heard of before. And really what it is this concept of collective exposures, things that we're exposed to throughout our life. That could be chemicals, that could be mold and mycotoxins, certainly the food we eat, and how that impacts us as human beings, as individuals, both from a biochemical standpoint, physiology standpoint, mental, emotional standpoint. So there's a lot of areas we can get into with this type of discussion. And we're going to focus on some things that I think are affecting many people, even though sometimes they don't necessarily recognize that. There could be certain environmental chemicals that people are exposed to or other types of things. So I am joined today by Dr. Mark Su. Dr. Su has a special interest in this concept of the exposome, as do I. So I'm looking forward to this conversation and seeing where this topic goes. So Mark, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Kurt.
So before we get started, give the audience a little bit of background on your education, your training, and how you got interested in this topic.
Sure. So I finished medical school in 2000 in Indiana, and Tufts residency in 2003, and I've been in practice for 21 years. My dad was a drug researcher for Eli Lilly. My parents are immigrants from China and Taiwan, so it's an interesting dichotomy. And I think it's just a kind of background on my just curiosity factor, having grown up in a sort of more balanced approach to science and health, if you will. You know, my dad was a drug researcher for Lilly, but he's like sitting in his work den in the house working on drug research with an acupuncture needle in his hand, right? That kind of thing. So just a kind of balanced view. And I think I'm just a curious person by nature. I don't take credit for it. And so when I was in practice and just constantly asking questions as you do as well, we've had a lot of conversations around this kind of thing, thinking about root causes and mechanisms and why, which sometimes drives us up a wall, right? But
Exactly.
It's a never-ending quest of the hamster wheel that we can't get off of. But, there's a lot of fulfillment and answers to be found when we ask those questions. And so, along the way, in my professional journey, let's say somewhere around 2008, 2009, I get introduced to the topic of chronic Lyme disease, which I wasn't very familiar with, but had a few patients introduced to me in 2005, 2006. And that led me down a journey. And then years later, kind of discovered with people who are chronically ill anyway, and why. And it's all about inflammation on some level or another, right? I sometimes get a little cringy thinking about or saying the word inflammation because it's so broad, but very, very relevant to what we're talking about today. And so then chronic Lyme turns into, a lot of these people don't get that much better because, there's a lot more going on. There's, they have mold-related illness. What is that about? All right, mold and mold toxins or fungal toxins. And then years after that, there's this whole topic of worm parasites. And then, it just stacks on each other, one topic after another. And so put it all together when you ask, how do I think about, or how did I arrive at this topic of the exposome? In the end, collectively, I reflect back and say, hey, a lot of people deal with a lot of issues. It's seemingly rarely, the sick of the person's rarely, if never, one diagnostic condition. And so the question is, well, how do you think about these topics in sequence or in prioritization or additively, collectively? What's the impact? Yeah, they're all bugs and toxins that additively, collectively, synergistically, even negatively cause inflammation. Right? They all burden the immune system and cause immune reactivity. So there you go. The exposome is the study or knowledge or all things related to our exposures, things that are in our environment, that they're not inherently originating from us. We did not make it. Doesn't mean it's all bad. Doesn't mean they're all going to cause problems. And everyone's going to have a different level of reactivity for various reasons that, we'll put that aside for a second. But yeah, it's our environmental exposures collectively.
And so I think you just perfectly defined this concept, right? It's the exposures that we all have that are sort of, that many people have, but the way we react to them is a unique thing based on our biochemistry, our genetics, etc. But the collective aspect of these, and that's going to be different for different people, but driven down to the fundamental level, these things tend to drive inflammatory problems, for example, or immune dysregulation that can manifest in various ways. So in this concept of, and I'm calling it exposome, we might pronounce it a little bit differently, but what are some, let's just take sort of the typical, general person, who's sort of seeking your counsel for just general wellness, right? And then I want to talk about more of the chronically ill type of person. But somebody that's coming in and saying, okay, hey, I've got some fatigue issues, I'm not sleeping very well, maybe I have some, chronic gut problems, for example. I'm curious, are there things that you're seeing in people that perhaps they're being exposed to environmentally, mold, mycotoxins, that may be impacting that general person that you're sort of trying to address? I know each person's a little bit different, but sort of that general wellness patient of some things that they can think about, that things within their environment, things that they're doing perhaps that maybe have the greatest impact on them from an ill health standpoint, if I asked that question correctly.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, so as I, this is for anybody, listening to this later or whatnot, this is generally unscripted. So, it's a great question. And so let's take so breaking down your question, let's start with someone who's not really ill, right? Someone who's, and in fact, let's put it in the framework of the big buzzword these days, or the big buzz, a big buzz topic, longevity and anti-aging, right? So let's talk about patients who are decently fine or well, or they're health enthusiasts. They want to optimize their health, even possibly like, hey, I've heard about longevity, anti-aging, whatever. What can I do, in that regard? And when we apply the exposome topic in that framework, then just 3 days ago, I was on the phone with. So True Diagnostic is a lab that arguably has the premier biologic clock test out right now, right? Biologic age testing. I happen to know a lot about it because it turns out, I don't remember if we've talked about this before, Kurt, or not, but my wife is in research. She's on staff at Harvard. I would argue she is a top 5 researcher in the world of what's called metabolomics. And a lot of her research has moved into this world of longevity and anti-aging. And beyond, compartmentalizing today how we define aging and all that, but it very much intersects with what we're talking about with inflammation. Ultimately, it is going to be about, there's a lot of research in that realm to do with the exposome. And so as I'm talking to the founder of the lab, who I know decently well, I'm asking, what are the big movers? Now that you've had this test out for a few years, you've got a lot of research around it. You guys are publishing paper after paper after paper, and you've become this frontier forerunner in the world with epigenetic and genetic testing, metabolomic testing, et cetera. What are the big movers that really drive longevity and anti-aging, which is really, in essence, the question we're asking right now. Right. What are the things that we can do to address exposomes? Okay, so his response categorically, number one is there are some pharmacologic interventions that by studies are the most impacting. Okay, we're going to put that aside because that's not necessarily to do with the exposome. So the categorical number 2 answer is a lifestyle change, specifically nutrition. And that's where I would start this discussion here. So there's meaningful data around Mediterranean diet particularly, but just cleaner eating in general. And I can even say, I think it's an unpublished study that my wife had shown them, that lab in January. I happened to be present with that conversation, where by epigenetic and metabolomic testing with multiple biologic clock measures, many of the diets all lead to anti-aging. I don't know that they would say they're 100% all equal, but they're all positive. And the take-home message that was verbalized there in that meeting was, the common denominator is there's some caloric restriction, which we know is anti-aging, and people are eating less processed foods, and they're just eating healthier, right? So I think that, for me, there's a reflection there. People who are less sick, we can still lean on. I'm at this time and at this point in the game, I'm confident that we can lean on the lifestyle changes that we all know about, but we are variably effective in executing, myself included, right? And I think we could start with cleaner eating. We can't go wrong there, all right? So less, but more organically. The Dirty Dozen. The Consumer Reports has come out. Just this last spring about household chocolates, not about the chocolates, but about the metals in the chocolates, right? We've had this conversation on the email forum, Kurt, as well, over a year ago about the other report, not from Consumer Reports, but about lead, cadmium, et cetera, in chocolates. Where's those chocolates coming from? Where's the sourcing of the lead, cadmium, et cetera, right? So we could point to the I think it's the RDA. Has pulled several packets of different brands of applesauce or cinnamon for, again, lead as well as other metals, et cetera.
Yep.
So we can start with food. All right. It may not be flashy, new, sexy, but hey, eating healthier, that's an exposome sourcing, no doubt.
So Mark, real quickly, and that's excellent, and that's almost exactly what I thought you were going to say, because so I've interviewed many people on this podcast.
This point be so predictable.
No. It's important because it drives home the concept, not the concept. It drives home the principle that when you get down to health, longevity, recovery, sustainability, maintenance, whatever, fundamentally it's what we're eating, and just as importantly, sometimes what we're not putting in our mouth, what we're not eating. So this is critical because it really lays down the foundation for overall health. So again, Mediterranean, longevity diet, whatever, right? We're moving towards the realm of healthier eating, which means we're reducing processed foods, we're reducing polyunsaturated fatty acids and things that drive oxidative stress. We're getting rid of chemicals. All of that collectively helps our physiology because essentially our body, our biochemistry is geared towards utilizing nutrients to make things work. So that's excellent. So that's right up front. And I know you mentioned sort of maybe step one with some pharmacological stuff, but putting that aside, what most people have access to and what they can choose to do on a daily basis is what they do within their diet. So excellent. So go ahead.
Because we're talking about step one, the step one is more, that's specific to longevity and anti-aging. If we're asking about exposome reduction, right? Well, the step one is not pertinent to that. So the real step one when it comes to exposome reduction is cleaner eating. Right. As far as the data we have right now, right? Now, so agreed. Some, healthier eating with a nutrient factor and just support of this or this or this, but also reduction of the chemicals and blah, 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 blah. I mean, you and I and many of us, many people know, hey, people who have gluten sensitivities or whatever, they don't have the same gluten sensitivities in Europe or elsewhere, right? They can eat those breads and drink those wines and not have reactivity like they do in the US. There's differences as a, obvious evident reflection that, there are different makeups. And so when we talk about exposome exposures, I think, again, we could break that topic into frequency and potency of an exposure. And I'll just stay right now on just the frequency, right? I could be exposed to problem X on a low level, but week after week, year after year. I could be exposed to problem B, which, comparatively unit for unit might be a bigger problem, but I was only exposed to it for a week at a high intensity. Well, after a 2-year period, or after a 5-year period, or after a just 6-month period, which is a bigger problem for my immune system and my body? I don't know, right? I think this is all stuff we don't know, and there's no way to know right now. But right now we're focusing, I'm kind of pointing more at the things that I'm regularly exposed to, i.e., what I'm eating.
Right.
If there's a mold environment at the local library that I frequent once every month for a half year, and then I stop going, and I don't go again for 4 years, is that a bigger deal to me than the chemicals I'm eating and the foods I'm like on a daily to weekly basis? Probably not, variably, right? But so these are all factors. It gets, this is why AAI is like a real thing that is meaningful, and that's a lot of what my wife and her research group and folks like True Diagnostic, that's what they're all about right now, is trying to put this stuff together. So big picture, zooming back out, the wellness folks who are not so sick, I would easily argue we start with our food topics, and we could easily then translate that into what we're breathing and also our water sourcing, and talk about our water filters and stuff like that. But that's where I would start on that.
Excellent.
On that level.
So, and by the way, real quickly, I want to just add in, you mentioned calorie restriction, intermittent fasting, these different concepts. One of the things it's important for people to understand, not only are there's the data out there of obviously moving towards a more whole food, real food diet, getting away from processed. That's going to have a tremendous effect on overall health. But this whole aspect of calorie restriction, many times the intermittent fasting concepts too, these things have been shown to also improve health, longevity, primarily through autophagy. And that's one of the natural process of getting rid of old, damaged, worn out cells, so that we have a greater capacity for regeneration, whether that's happening at a true cellular level within the mitochondria, for example. I read an interesting article recently about how important that can be within the immune system as well, which means that people who have a tremendous amount of either allergy or tendency towards autoimmunity, for example, this concept this principle of autophagy is critically important. So what else is on that list? You talked about nutrition. So that general wellness person who's into sort of health and longevity, what else may impact their exposome, for example, the things that maybe they're doing on a continual basis? A few things come to my mind. I'm just curious what you had to say. You talked about things that we might be exposed to environmentally, but is there anything else that we could fit into this category for people to consider?
Well, I mean, if we just extend off of the category of lifestyle factors, I think for me anyway, stereotypically, most people are thinking eating and exercise, right? Nutrition and movement. And, the flip side of that with exercise movement is more that it's a, form of detox, right? It is essentially detox. People poop more often when they exercise. We expel more easily, whether peeing, pooping, we're sweating, we're breathing, we're expelling toxins. So that's sort of the flip side of the coin. It's not necessarily reducing our environmental exposures. It's more outletting the exposures that we build up. Because as I say to patients all the time, like, basically, look, it's an unavoidable, it's an inevitability. The longer we live, the more we're going to become greater reservoirs of bugs and toxins, the exposome. We've lived longer, right? The young kids they're not going to be as inflamed or have as much of a total body burden of the exposome, because they just haven't lived long enough, right? So there's a constant benefit and need, or outright need to detox, and exercise certainly is an easy, hard to argue, if not impossible to argue against intervention there, right? And I think on a big picture, on a more, philosophical or maybe sociologic basis, I don't look at it as like a doomsday thing or a negative Nelly and that kind of thing, but it's just, look, our environmental exposures, I think we can all agree, are it's a greater problem now than it was 20 years ago, than it was 40 years ago, 60 years ago. It's just as as society and cultures around the world evolve and we make more and more new synthetic stuff, and and the earth as a whole, our climate, et cetera, is more burdened, worn out, and kind of, less ideal, less pure, more imbalanced. We're just living in a more toxic world, and I don't mean that in a gaslighting way. It's just on a factual level. We live in a more toxic world, and we, unfortunately, it may not be it may not be our fault, but it's still our problem. Right? It's the hand of cards that we're dealt with, born and living in this generation versus 100 years ago. And so when I'm talking to a patient, so I'm sticking on this, avatar or a phenotype patient of profile of someone who's generally healthy, i.e., they're not like chronically symptomatic, or needing to deal with chronic illness and inflammation. Hey, look, if you want to keep things simple, you can do what you're doing. But if we're not making some level of mindful, intentional effort to detox and to keep up with our maintain our detox processes and be mindful about our exposome intake, over time we have a much greater risk of aging and of having chronic inflammation than if I was born 40, 50 years ago. It's just the nature of the beast.
So, and that's exactly right. We're all exposed. I tell people all the time, none of us live in a bubble. We can't necessarily control everything that's in our environment. We can certainly control what we buy, what we spray in our yard, the food that we eat, the things that we consume. We can control that, but we can't control all variables. So we have to find our way somehow through this and live as high quality a life as possible. And so if we take it back to the level of nutrition, there's things obviously that we can control there, but even with that, there's a level of trust obviously in that what we're purchasing, should be healthy if it says so on the label. But, again, there's many variables, but for the most part, the law of averages over time, a real food, whole foods diet is going to provide us, good nutrition. To your point about detoxification, the way I always looked at it is many times people are looking for this active thing to do to detox, and clearly there's various things that are helpful for detox, sauna therapy, for example. But just moving your body, as you mentioned, exercise. It doesn't always have to be that you're going to the gym, doing some, HIIT program for 45 minutes. Although that could be beneficial, it's not tolerated by everybody. But just moving, going for walks, being outside, getting fresh air, moving the body, getting the musculoskeletal system moving the blood, moving the lymphatics, all of that stuff has an effect at improving underlying physiology. And the nutrition that we eat, I've often told people a lot of times in my practice that our body is geared towards detoxification. So when you give the body the nutrients it needs, it in many regards automatically is going to move towards a state of detox, whether it's improved kidney function, liver function, bowel function, etc. So would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And excuse me. And as I, pulling back to, I absolutely agree. Absolutely. And I think extending off of one or two of the comments you made there, back to your original question of what might be other steps, right? A next step, or, in terms of exposures, et cetera. I would consider thinking about, in this point, thinking more about the individual, or maybe not necessarily the one-to-one individual, but the sort of regional community, what kind of communities the person live in. So therefore, i.e., if I'm working in, or I'm seeing patients in the Pittsburgh area, for example, and I only pick on that here's an example. Okay, we can talk about the food part for everybody universally. I don't think that's arguable. And look, a lot of the foods we all get, no matter where we live in this day and age, they're brought in from all over the world, right? And so they're not all local grown, and so there's not as much of a geographic exposome profile now with food than there was years ago. Now, if we think about other exposome entities categorically. Okay, well, what is the person in front of me? What's their life like in terms of where they live, where they work, and what their activities are like? So if I got somebody who is an outdoors person, right, then we're talking about possible vector-borne or insect bite type of problems, right? I mean, it's in the news nowadays about West Nile, Triple E. I mean, it's crazy what we're here in Massachusetts, what we're seeing. And I mean, there's towns, I've never seen this before. The towns are asking people not to be outside after dark. They're like closing parks, unofficially, if you will. I don't know that they're enforcing it, but because of tripling West Nile. I mean, Tony Fauci had West Nile. I mean, I've just never seen this before. It's always like a more hypothetical to me, right? Or if I'm thinking, again, if I'm in Pittsburgh, not to be picking on Pittsburgh, it's just, I saw in my Apple News feed, like in the last week, there was a video article about the Parkinson belts in America, and that hey, there's some emerging or recently, printed or whatever released information that some scientists are now linking Parkinson's with industrial toxins. Well, for you and I, that's not really news. But okay, so it's hit the news again in some kind of from a new origin source or some further validation of studies or whatever. But yeah, so, again, it's not my fault that I was born in or lived in Pittsburgh or whatever, brought up in Pittsburgh, but it's still my problem that I've had those exposures, right? So, what is a person exposed to unintentionally, passively, from activities, from environments I may live or work in? So you mentioned like, fungal toxins, mycotoxins. Sure. If I'm living in, if I'm a plumber and I'm, in and out of all kinds of environments that are very, very water, moist and very likely water damaged, recurrently, especially chronically, recurrently, et cetera. That's a bigger deal. If there's a lot of public buildings that don't budget for water damage and they don't put necessarily the optimal or ideal or best practices for remediating water damage, schools, libraries, government buildings, et cetera, then I'm not being judgmental. Then those can be issues as well. So I started thinking about the profile of maybe the individual as a strong second or third step in terms of the exposing of that individual.
I've worked a lot with the autism community over the years, and you mentioned Pittsburgh, and I had consulted with a family many years ago who was not in Pittsburgh, but sort of around that area, exposed to similar types of, chemical compounds. And they made the comment that every time they went to Florida and rented a beach house, their child was much more integrated, much more social, much less hyperactive. When they go back home, the old patterns returned. And, we finally realized was that their environment was greatly affecting this child. There was improvement with diet. There was improvement in just being outdoors and not stuck inside all the time. But they just could not get away from the reality that the local environment where they were living was not healthy for their child. And there wasn't much more they could really do than really consider moving. And I'm not saying that is necessarily the case for everybody.
Right.
But that's a real thing. So we talk, again, right, the diet, moving, exercise, but your environment, your social network, all of those things certainly would come into this concept of things that we're exposed to. And I would even expand that to just the social pressures and things that we see in media and some of the other aspects that things affect us from a mental emotional level. We know, Mark, and how that can translate down chemically through signals through the brain that affect the immune system. All of that, of course, can have its own impact as well. And I would sort of expand that as part of this exposome, type of discussion. The other
Absolutely.
thing,
a lot of directions.
Yeah, and the other thing I think too, and I want to shift real quickly, but of course, we fundamentally think about nutrition, diet, exercise, good sleep, right? I think that's purely fundamental. We could have an entire discussion just on sleep and the importance of sleep, but that would certainly also, I think, play into this as well. And what I've seen for many people, even people who are generally, seeking wellness and longevity, there's a lot of chronic sleep problems that are occurring in our society. It's not just something that's happening in people with chronic illness, but the aspect of poor sleep is pretty significant. So let's shift gears real quickly. And we could go in many different directions, but I want to talk now just sort of in general about that person with a chronic illness. And again, their chronic illness could be induced by many things. You mentioned Lyme, there could be an accident, there could be other kinds of trauma. To me, the principle of the exposome still comes into play in what we talked about. Fundamentally, it comes down to a real food, whole food diet, still trying to be active, still trying to be outside. Again, your environment, we can't always control. But I think what conventional medicine often gets locked into is that there has to be a cause, something that is the main trigger for a particular illness. And I'm wondering what your experience is, because you've mentioned that right up front. You talked about you working with people with Lyme or tick-borne illnesses, and then realize, oh my gosh, well, they have mold and mycotoxin exposure, and wow, they're getting exposed to this other chemical over here, and maybe this is, affecting their overall problem. So explain how you approach now somebody who's coming to you with a chronic illness, for example, in what the kind of conversation you might have with somebody regarding this concept, and then certain areas that you're targeting in on to try to move the needle as best as possible for them.
Yeah. Again, there's different directions we could go with this, but I guess on a clinical so there's two parts of that. Two parts of the response. One is on a clinical paradigm, and a lot of this, again, I didn't mention my wife whimsically, and I'm, it's not about me. I'm bragging on her, but a lot of my thinking has been meaningfully influenced by the work that I see her doing professionally. Like when she talks about the kind of research they do in metabolomics, right? I mean, it's literally like AI before AI was a thing. Years and years ago, I remember in a summer program, she and some group of people, they toured the national security, the NSA in DC, and they could tell, they knew they were using computers, crunching more data faster than at the NSA.
Wow.
Right. And so, they got published. This is an illustration, and I don't hold me to it because this is not 100% accurate. And I keep asking her intermittently over the last couple of years if she can reproduce what that paper was, and she can't figure out which paper it was because she wasn't. But she told me years ago. She said, "Oh, look," she's like, "This is so amazing, Mark. This group of colleagues I know from wherever it was, they're publishing a paper now where they've identified that there's this group of let's call it 17 to 24-year-old boys from a specific province in Mexico that has a genetic heritage, ethnic link to a certain place in India historically, who they become rapidly obese, and no one's figured out why. And it's now been mapped and figured out, right? And this is the thing, it's like connecting the dots, that perfect storm. They have a genetic predisposition, they have a vitamin D deficiency, and then they've had two certain kinds of environmental exposures, all within that age range, where now they get a genetic or epigenetic upregulation that leads to rapid obesity. And you can only really address it and reverse engineer it, first and foremost, to my recall anyway, you got to be sure the vitamin D piece is optimized, otherwise nothing will work. It was something along those lines, okay? And I probably did not do it justice at all, but the point is that when hearing that over and over, I'm like, different people, either individually or in subpopulation groups, have some kind of magical sort of perfect storm that we don't want because it leads to problems, inflammation, right? In this case, obesity. And so what is that combination? What is that lock, that combo on the lock that we're trying to find to unlock that bike lock and, set forth healing and freedom, right? And so the bottom line is, in my mind, it's multifactorial. The sicker the person, the more problems there are. And that's not to be negative glass, half glass empty. It's just, it is what it is. And if we go back briefly, just for a second, on that whole metabolomic and what's happening now, aging and et cetera, and this is a lot of my wife's work, because she started out more in genetics and then moved into this whole epigenetic and metabolomic work. One of the biggest take homes, I've heard her say this so many times in so many conferences, when they did the Human Genome Project, and some of that work was strongly done at MIT she knows some of those people and wasn't directly involved, but she was very familiar with it. The end take home was, wow, holy crap, our genetics across the world are not that different. That was like one of the big take home points was we're expecting to find all this amazing stuff, and in the end we kind of proved ourselves wrong. It's nature versus nurture. The nature, the genetics, yeah, it can matter, but not nearly as much as we think it does. Ultimately, the big message take home from that was it's largely all about the epigenetics, and largely the epigenetics is extremely, I won't say all, but extremely influenced by our exposome, our environmental exposures, and including our life experiences, as you already alluded to, that can, stressors and traumas and other things. So that, and there's even data now about the impact of that, our exposomes, including life stressors and circumstances, our mental emotional health, if you will, carrying through epigenetics into our next generations even. It's crazy. Getting back to...
Yeah, Mark, and it is crazy, and it's important, and I love the fact that you brought that up in tying it back to research that your wife has done or is doing and looking at what's happening. That's been my thought as well. It's been what I've been researching, is what I've come across. It really comes down to so much when you actually study molecular and cellular biology is the epigenetic factors. It's pretty impressive. So go on, continue.
Yeah, so kind of nailing into now with that context, when you say, how do I think about the more chronically sick people? Then number one, it's a multifactorial problem, and so I always lead with I emphasize responding to a patient, trying to meet them where they're at. If I'm given if I'm giving full opportunity, I take a really wide look, on evaluation testing in whatever form that may be. Sometimes it's just collecting data they've already collected before from past testing. Sometimes it's, doing testing now. Sometimes it's questionnaires and surveys and not necessarily lab testing of the body specimens. But basically, I'm trying to get as wide and as deep of a profile of the person's exposome as I can, of the different bugs and toxins. And there's all kinds of ways of collecting that info about different subclinical persistent bugs, persistent chemical, various kinds of synthetic toxicants, as well as biologic toxins. And then simultaneously looking at a whole other category of the self, our immune system, our hormones, our nutrition factors, and then of course the sort of third part of the equation I think about, the regulatory, what I call the interfaces, or the first points of contact between ourself and our environmental exposures, which largely involves our gut, especially dominantly, but also sometimes our skin and respiratory system. So back to the exposome, it's basically what can we find to help quantify and characterize the breadth and depth of the person's exposome profile. And if I think you kind of alluded to it before, so I'll just jump ahead and say, like, all right, so what are the common things that we're finding? I think many of us in the colleague practitioner community that we intersect and share within. A lot of folks are focusing on tick-borne illness or mold-related illness or a variety of other smattering issues, whether it's heavy metals, helminth parasites. Nowadays, there's obviously talk about the COVID and vaccine topics at times. I mean, the list is endless, right? The list is endless. So I try to look at things from a categorical approach and just pull things together and think about the categories. But it can be a lot, right? And that's the second response point. That is that it can be overwhelming. And for me, I start thinking about how do other practitioners approach this problem? And not to get in too much of a sidebar rabbit hole here, but what I encourage and advocate without judgment or without trying to be overwhelming is if I as a practitioner am only niching into one or two topics, that's fine. But if my patient's not getting better, if I'm aware that there's so many other exposome topics that I'm not looking into, then for the patient's best for integrity and the patient's best interests, how much better am I going to be able to get them digging deeper on one or two topics versus looking wider at the other potential causes of inflammation from the other exposome categories or entities that I'm not looking at, right? And as a patient, if I know this, in paradigm, then it would only serve me best to at least be aware of that. I'm not saying it's not a value judgment. It's not a leverage thing or a comparison thing. It's just on a paradigm level, it is hard. It is hard to think about all these topics at one time, and you can't be done all at once. It can't be done in a compressed, ram it through. It's impossible, but it is a journey, and that's why the sicker patients, that's the hardest thing for me right now is how do we message to those sicker patients how to anticipate and forecast the journey without making it sound like it's such a overwhelming experience, which it often is for the sickest patients, but you don't want to paint that picture up front, right? Because it's not a pretty picture.
Well, I think in reality, Mark, there is always hope, and I think it's important to convey the message, particularly for chronically sick people, and you're doing a clinical history and trying to find out perhaps through that history of what were some triggers that seem to push that individual, over the edge. I often mention to people, it's like we all walk around with a bucket, right? We have different size bucket in what our body can tolerate. And so some people have small buckets, others have larger buckets. But eventually through life, that bucket tends to get filled up to some degree. And if that bucket gets completely filled, it starts spilling over, and that's where we start having health problems. And so part of what we were talking about earlier on with changing a diet and lifestyle and exercise is trying to detox, is trying to empty that bucket to some degree. But it is a process. Chronic illness is a process of trying to sort of discover and unravel what are some of the problems that may be contributing, as you mentioned up front, to the inflammatory response. Let me throw a couple things at you real quick before we wrap this up. What I've experienced, and I want to see if you agree, maybe you have a different perspective. But again, right, it's not necessarily meant for just a particular person, but in general. The things from an exposome standpoint, okay, put aside the genetics, put aside the nutrition, put aside the exercise component, we talked about sleep. Microbes. Generally, I find that a lot within the immune system is often adversely triggered by exposure to different types of pathogens. And I would include in that mold and mycotoxins, which seems to be a major trigger for many people to really ramp up that inflammatory immune response. Second to that would likely be more sort of in the realm of chemicals. And I know I'm kind of oversimplifying this. And then from there, you've got heavy metals and whatever else. But I think our immune system is so geared towards recognizing different types of pathogens in our environment and then having some type of immune response and inflammatory response second to that. Has that been your perspective? Does the pathogen aspect really seem to be a big driver as far as an exposome concept, maybe even the mold mycotoxins?
Well, so for me, it's the analytical. I'll keep it bullet pointed. Analytically speaking, and the analytical brain in my head says I cannot objectively respond with confidence comparing pathogens versus chemical or versus toxins and toxicants, right? Having said that, you and I both know the tick-borne topic in particular, when I think about bugs, pathogens, that's a big driver. There's so many people I've seen that we've treated for tick-borne topics that have had meaningful change. All right. Quick example, last year, a teacher comes in at June, he's 58. He says, I feel like I'm 68. I'm going to have to change. I usually, as you know, Mark, I usually exercise more in the summer, get better in shape and blah, blah. I can't do that this year. It must be I'm just getting older. I have to use my hands to pull my leg out of my car because I'm so stiff and achy. I can't get out of my car on my own. We diagnosed, won't give him the story, we diagnosed the tick-borne topic, treated him for 5 months. And at the end of 5 months in November, he tells me, I now feel like I'm 48. Verbatim, he says, I feel like I'm 48 and I'm now motivated to exercise during the school year as a teacher that I don't usually do, right? 5 months, that's it. And then that's not typical, but it's also because he's not a chronically ill person, okay? So there's an example of the bugs. Like I'm completely convicted about the tick-borne topic, but there's many kinds of bugs and all the toxins they make. So then you talk about the fungus, right? Mold and yeast. Yeah, they can be problems, but it seems to me that generally speaking, they're creating less symptomatology and inflammation directly, but the toxins they make, whether we breathe it in from our environment or from the fungus, mold and toxins in mold and fungus, mold and yeast inside of us, those toxins are some of the most immune suppressing toxins that at least I'm aware of. So that's like a 2-for-1. So for me, when I'm looking at someone's whole category of exposomes, the bugs and toxins, and I'm trying to sequence it out, what prioritization am I going to give? The mold toxin, the fungal toxins is definitely near the high part of the list, the front part of the list, because it's like a 2-for-1. You know, my wording for patients is kind of like dodgeball. It's like, okay, you knock out some of the toxins that are bad, and then you actually get good guys back in. Your immune system comes back in place. So it's like a 2-for-1. So yeah, I agree with all those pieces. And I think you had a third part, but I'll stop there for time and let you go from there.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I love that, actually. And you're absolutely right about the mycotoxins, the toxins that these organisms produce and how they affect the immune system and then create a cascading effect from there. That's exactly right and exactly what I've seen. So Mark, just in summary, we mentioned hope. You know, what are a hopeful message, particularly I think for people who are dealing with chronic illness, and then a little bit more about how people find you.
Yeah, actually, one more bullet point. You mentioned, I remembered your other part was the chemicals. So I will comment. I've seen multiple times, my wife has mentioned in their, metabolomic and epigenetic data research that forever chemicals are a big, big deal, right, on inflammation. Like there's some of the top pieces, PFAS and all that stuff. So I won't go into more of that, but there is definitely a big piece. And we could make a comment there like, hey, they're called forever chemicals for a reason. And if they're in our bodies, then the fact that they're called forever means they don't go away easily.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. There's absolutely no doubt. These chemical compounds are absolutely problematic. And it's sort of this, I look at these things sort of like these Venn diagrams, right? There's individual aspects and then they have an overlapping aspect with other things that we get exposed to. And essentially that becomes the exposome, right? So
yeah, it's basically a persistent exposure in our bodies.
Exactly.
So yeah, quick, hard pivot over into your question. So hope, right? I think for me, if it's a sick person, it is a journey. It's a hero's journey. It can be a dark journey, but just finding the ways to get through the tough days or weeks, and knowing that there's always ways to reduce inflammation proactively or remove exposome burdens in our body to reduce the inflammation. There's always hope. It's just difficult in the moment. And I would argue that anyone who keeps head down into one topic and you're not making progress, or our patients are not making progress in the big picture, it's at least time to question whether we need to look elsewhere into a different topic instead of just going deeper and deeper in that one rabbit hole. All right. And that's just an action point that gives hope. Otherwise, if we're talking about a healthier person, then we may not necessarily need as much like hope, but it's to say, if we're talking about hope in terms of the big picture of just we're constantly exposed to toxins and such, hey, the earlier we nip things in the bud, the less likely we're going to land in those problems. And that's not a sexy thing in America. Prevention medicine is not well adopted and embraced in America, but we at the very least, I'm a big proponent that we want to be careful about minimizing. I've just known too many people who, especially, guys, stereotypically guys, like, I'm not bleeding. Like, I don't want to bother people. It's too much burden. Like, maybe it'll get better on its own. 2 years later, maybe it'll get better on its own, but it's not. We got to at least be aware the odds are stacked against us sociologically, just in where we are in this generation. The odds are stacked against us. It's not our fault, but it's still our problem. We just got to be mindful and aware and take some action, or at least ask from time to time, and not just keep putting things under the rug, because we don't want to get in that bad hole and be those super sick patients who they don't want anybody else to have to suffer what they're suffering through either.
Right.
Beyond that, there's so many things out there to do. It's hard to pick and choose, and that's for another time. But there's so many things that can be done. But each person's in a different boat as to motivation, resources, etc. So that's where working with somebody who can support and be there and be part of that journey, it's priceless.
So, Mark, one of the things I've always appreciated about your writing and interact with you is this concept of pulling the lens back, and you described that perfectly. If you're down a rabbit hole and you're too focused in, sometimes you have to pull things back and say what else may be going on. So I think the message is really for people out there is hope. There's help. Seek help. Ask questions and keep searching for answers. There's a lot of practitioners like you out there who have great information, and I appreciate you joining me today. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Privilege always.
You've been listening to the Functional Medicine Doc Talk podcast with Dr. Kurt Woeller. For more information about this podcast, go to functionalmedicinedoctalk.com.